This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
The experiences I had, the people I met, the things I got to see and do, priceless, priceless. Yes, I would do it again.
Radio as it was in the 1980s. We go inside outdoors with Pondering Kentucky, a show that celebrated our state, its people, outdoors, traditions, as no other show ever could. My friend, and if you've heard Pondering Kentucky, your friend too, Glen Bastin, next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Christmas means deer season in more ways than one. Have the Jolly Reindeer drop off the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife gift certificate, perfect for anyone on your list who has hunting on theirs. Find it at fw.ky.gov.
Once there were three wise men. They were the travelers of their day. They traveled far and at night, using only the stars to guide their way. They never got a ticket or caused crashes. It was a miracle. But come to find out, they were never really in the dark at all. It's an age-old story that still applies when you give the gift of driving wise. A holiday wish for safe travels from your Kentucky Office of Highway Safety.
Honey, what'd you get your brother?
The Fish and Wildlife gift certificate.
Fishing for ideas, hunting for gifts, give the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife gift certificate for the person on your list with the great outdoors on theirs. Online at fw.ky.gov.
John McGregor has shared with us his recordings of the frogs of Kentucky, all 20 species, including this one, which is rarely heard. That sort of sounds like a bunch of geese. What is this one?
That's a strange-looking frog. It's called a spadefoot, and really like no other frog. It's in its own family. Funny-looking thing with vertical eyes like a cat. It lives underground. It comes up just to breed, maybe any time between April and October. It breeds, it goes back underground, and that's the last you see of it.
The sound of this program takes you back to the early 80s, telling the story of Kentucky one character at a time.
Every story on Pondering Kentucky, the magazine, is about something related to Kentucky.
The show was Pondering Kentucky, carried on radio stations across our state by one of the industry's most engaging storytellers. Glen Bastin, welcome to Kentucky Afield.
Thank you.
Go ahead and get that drink of coffee. I'm not going to deprive you of that coffee.
I got to have coffee. That's sort of a routine that started because I was working early morning radio. I had never drank coffee until I had to start going to work at 3:30 in the morning at WHAS when I first went there in the late 60s.
We are on 970 WGTK in Louisville, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to understand. We're not here to promote their competition, but in interest of history, you were working there. We're getting up at 3:30 in the morning.
That's when I first started, yes. And interesting, on that 970 signal, there's a great connection to Pondering Kentucky with it. When it was WAVE, then became WAVG, I recorded the original Pondering Kentuckys in their studios.
Did you now?
And they carried the broadcast. Not the guy I worked for across town, but they carried the broadcast. Yeah.
I'll be darned.
Ed Henson and his family were the owners at the time. Yeah, a lot of history there.
Yeah, Ed Henson is one of the fine fellows of radio in this state. That's just hands down.
You know who Carl Hurley is?
Of course I know Carl Hurley.
And I quote him frequently. Carl came from an area not too far from where I grew up. He grew up in East Bernstadt, as everybody knows, in Laurel County. And I grew up in Pulaski, a little town called Eubank. We had 300 people.
I've seen the sign.
Actually, at one time, Highway 27 came right through the middle of town, and then they built a new Highway 27, and town started going downhill when they did that.
We are on in Somerset, WTLO.
That was the first station I ever said, "Hi, this is Glen Bastin."
Really?
Yes.
So that's where you got your start.
Well, in a roundabout way. WSFC is across town there, and in high school, we had a teen time hour. There were 5 high schools in the county, and each county got a half hour. Each high school got a half hour every Saturday to do virtually whatever we wanted to do. Now, we wound up playing music most of the time, and we'd dedicate it to our friends and buddies and what have you. But that was not a for-pay job. The first for-pay job was at WTLO. Worked sign-on Saturdays and Sunday mornings. An interesting story on how I got the job. I really wanted to work radio. That had been my dream since I was a kid. And the little town of Eubank had a furniture store called Bice Furniture. Bice had a distant relative who also lived there, and he owned part of WTLO. Ed Bice was the largest advertiser on WTLO. Mm-hmm. And so I walked about a block from my house when I'm 16 or 17, 18 years old. 17, I guess. Walked down to talk to Ed and tell him I sure would appreciate it if he would put in a good plug for me. He called the station manager, and a little while later I was working on the radio. It was just a little AM station at 1480.
It's neat to go back and reminisce.
It is, and there's a gentleman up in Grayson, Kentucky, who's written some history of broadcasting.
Francis Nash?
Francis Nash, yeah. He asked me to write up a little profile of myself, which I assume he's going to include me in it, in the book. And I got to, reminiscing about a whole lot of things, and I worked in a lot of places. 2 stations in Somerset, Moorhead, then to Glasgow to Bowling Green to Louisville. And after some years on WHAS, did a little work for KET, and then started Pondering Kentucky, which was the love of my life.
In the 80s, I wasn't in this state. I was working in radio in South Carolina, Columbia, Myrtle Beach, and playing the rock and roll and a whole bit, doing a lot of advertising. So I wasn't in Kentucky during the reign of Pondering Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
So I missed a lot. Now, I'm familiar. I can hear back, and we've got some little snippets that we'll play in and out of the show. What were the years?
When did we start that? We started it like 1982, 83. Pondering Kentucky celebrated, if you will, the people history of Kentucky. When we were going to school, Charlie, I don't know about you, but I remember being taught history, and we were taught politics and wars. We weren't taught about all the interesting people and things and developments and the things that affect our daily lives, like the inventor of the stoplight being born in Kentucky. We weren't taught that the first cheeseburger was fried in Kentucky, or that chewing gum, flavored chewing gum, originated with a pharmacist in Louisville. Those things, for some reason, never make it into the educational
process. Lost in time.
Yeah, and so that's what Pondering Kentucky celebrated. We have the largest handmade stained glass window in the world in a church in northern Kentucky. This place where we're sitting here, this preserve that is the Department of Fish and Wildlife's headquarters, it's more than just a building with a bunch of people in it working. You got a museum. You've got a lake where there's somebody out there fishing right now, I bet. You've got an observation area where you can go and watch birds and wildlife. The sportsmen of Kentucky who go hunting and fishing, my guess is the overwhelming majority of them have never been on this property. But I would suggest that at some point, if they're anywhere near Frankfort, they come by and take a look. And there's a nice little drive around the lake, and it's a wonderful piece of property that needs to be discovered, which is true of the first brick house in Kentucky.
Where was it?
As the Whitney House, located near Crab Orchard. And it was there that thoroughbred racing in America started running in the counterclockwise direction.
I've heard that story before. It's Sportsman's Hill.
Sportsman's Hill.
The William Whitley House.
Yes. Occasionally, I think they still have a horse race or two down there. But he hated the British so much, he declared that horse racing would not occur as it did in England on his property. And they started running the opposite way, and it's done like that in this country all over.
So you imagine yourself, you're sitting at the racetrack. The horses are going from left to right. That's counterclockwise if you were a bird watching it. Counterclockwise. Mm-hmm. So before, they were going clockwise. That's going right to left.
So that's the way they race in other sections of the world to this day.
Yeah, the English were doing it wrong.
Oh, I think so.
Indeed they were. We're chatting with the legend in Kentucky broadcasting, Glen Bastin, host of Pondering Kentucky, how Kentucky's outdoor life and wildlife were part of it. When we come back, I'm Charlie Baglin, and this is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglin back on Kentucky Afield Radio. On this edition of the show, we are telling stories first told by another radio program called Pondering Kentucky. My guest is host Glen Bastin. Let's go back.
Stories such as this one about growing up in a small Kentucky town. Laurel County's East Bernstadt, in the case of Dr. Carl Hurley.
We wanted our town to be like other towns. You know, one day a fellow said, we want a one-way street sign. Other towns have them. Ours caused the problem. We all got out of town and couldn't get home.
Dr. Hurley did grow up in East Bernstadt. Today, he is one of the country's best-known and sought-after speakers. He is also a subscriber to Pondering Kentucky, the magazine.
I love it. I enjoyed listening to Governor Chandler tell his stories. He's a master.
Isn't he?
And the fellow that did the chainsaw, that fellow has talent. And I really enjoyed the lady that was a pilot in World War II.
Mary Edith Engel?
Yes.
Kentucky Afield Radio focuses a lot on conservation, nature, wildlife, sportsman's interest, this type of thing. That was also present in your show.
Well, it wasn't. We weren't competition. We coexisted on many signals, but I wouldn't necessarily consider us competition. But there was so much that developed in the area of fish and wildlife from the time I was a teenager until I was, age of 50. The restocking of the deer, restocking of wild turkeys, the import of the elk, appearance again in eastern Kentucky, and they're slowly moving, I understand, of the bear. So many of these things developed that returned Kentucky life in rural areas. There were so many things that happened that was significant to the Kentuckians of old that had disappeared. My grandfather was never able to go hunting for wild turkey, nor a deer. But my dad renewed that when he was in his later years because of work that the Fish and Wildlife Department had done. That got to the point where he wasn't able to do a lot of deer hunting. He'd drive his truck up to the edge of the field and wait for a deer to come out and give up. But it was something that he certainly enjoyed throughout the latter part of his life, thanks to the work of this department.
National Public Radio. In my opinion, the United States is a better place with it than without it.
I agree.
And I have listened to that and was often inspired by what I heard. They would take a news story, and they still do that today. If you listen to All Things Considered, you're driving home, flip it over to NPR and give it a listen. See what you think. And you'll see the type of program that I'm about to describe. You not only hear it, you're actually transported to where you are. They have the actual sounds, the interviews, the trains going by, the wildlife in the hills. You can hear that. You would see yourself wherever the story was taking place. I said, that's cool. I can do that on Kentucky Afield Radio, and I did probably late 90s when I inherited the show, and it was only a 5-minute show. Ben, you did the same thing with Pondering Kentucky. Well, and what was the influence from NPR?
I was doing a broadcast on KET called Kentucky Considered. Kentucky Considered was a program where I concentrated somewhat on some of these things that we got into in Pondering Kentucky, although we did do some political stuff and a few other things. And it was a weekly broadcast out of the Lexington studios, and I would listen to the replay of All Things Considered as I drove home at night, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, or whatever. And I once heard a piece from a fellow on NPR out of somewhere in southeastern Kentucky. I don't remember the exact town. He may have been Hyden. I don't recall. But he was talking about things that I knew he didn't know anything about. Because he was talking about us.
Yeah.
We Kentuckians, right? And I thought, I can do that better. So I get back to my home base, which was my home, and I'm thinking, what should I do about this? I called a fellow named J.T. Whitlock, who ran a station in Lebanon and was also head of the Kentucky Broadcasters Association. I said, J.T., I got this idea. And he says, okay, tell me about it. I did. He said, well, you might be successful. You might get 25 stations to carry that. We signed on 6 weeks later with 48 stations and eventually reached 85 stations carrying Pondering Kentucky, which, again, was about Kentucky and Kentuckians.
People who listen to the radio are oftentimes passive listeners. They listen, they tune in, they tune out. They'll listen a few minutes at a time. They go off, they do something else. Come back, they listen to another song or two. They listen to the news. They turn it on, they turn it off. They may even bounce around from 1 or 2, 3 stations. They're transient listeners. That's not a criticism. It's basically a statement of fact in the way that people listen to radio today.
You have to grab people's attention to prevent that from happening. I remember a story from my days as a news director. We were having a little staff meeting, and I was talking to the staff about writing scripts. You've got to grab the listener's attention in the first 10 seconds of a story in order to get them to listen to it. If you say there was a meeting today and nobody cares.
Yeah, I'm asleep.
Yeah. But if you will use something to get their attention, then they'll listen to you. We stopped the staff meeting. I'm driving home from work. A fellow named Chuck Paddock is doing the news at 6 o'clock at night. The logo comes on. Da-da-da-da-da-da. This is Chuck Paddock. I quit.
God, really?
No, wait a minute.
Was that the story, or was he serious?
No, wait a minute. The story was people were being less transient in their jobs.
Gotcha.
They were staying in their jobs for a longer period of time. But Chuck used that and got my attention, even though I almost ran into a guardrail. But then he goes on to explain people aren't saying that nearly as much today. It worked, he got the attention, and that's what you have to do, I guess, in this business if you're going to get people involved with you. And hopefully Pondering Kentucky did that.
Hello, my name is Glen Bastin, and I think the way Governor Chandler opened his speeches pretty well sums up my dilemma.
My fellow Kentuckians all, ladies and gentlemen, I feel a bit like a mosquito that flew over the fence into the nudist camp. I hardly know where to start.
And the stories the governor told, well, no one else can tell them and make them as fun. And you simply cannot transfer that humor to paper.
Programming, and this is the part I'd like to get into, because what we can do here is give the listener a behind-the-scenes look at what goes into programming. Mark Twain wrote a comment once, said, I'm sorry that I wrote such a long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one. If you're doing a 5-minute show, Glen Bastin, they don't just come together in 5 minutes.
No, it's about 5 to 6 hours worth of work.
And that was every day?
There was a broadcast each day, but 5 to 6 hours for each 5-minute broadcast. Now, when I would go out, I'd go into the purchase area. I wouldn't just do one story. I would do maybe 8, 9, 10 stories in the purchase area so that I had that tape to work with, that information to work with. I might spend 2 days in the purchase area and come out with 10 stories. You have to. I looked up at your board here, and you've got the next 4 or 5 months mapped out
right.
on what you want to do on Kentucky Afield. Now, it can get a little bit hectic. There's no doubt about that, and sometimes there's long hours. But it's also, it was very enjoyable.
These were interviews by and large, and you would interview people about the pie they won at the state fair, what it may be.
Yes, one that sticks in my mind at the moment is an interview I did in Trigg County with a gentleman who grew up in what was then land betwixt the rivers.
Really?
Well, the lakes weren't there yet. They weren't. Two rivers. And in the Prohibition time frame, that was an extremely isolated area. And just about everybody, including the ministers, were involved in some sort of moonshining. The ministers might be the ones that sold the sugar and the other things that it took to manufacture the product. But it was a huge moonshining area, and it said that the what is now the land between the lakes supplied many of the Chicago speakeasies. But it was isolated. If the revenuers were going to come across, they had to do it by boat. And somebody would see them, and word would get out. And the gentleman told me stories about how people would dig a basement, put their still in, and build a house over top of it. And a lot of things like that just was really interesting.
And then as I traveled about the Commonwealth, the people always asked about Mama Chandler. How is she? I said, well, I haven't spoken to her for 2 weeks. And what's the matter? I said, I hadn't wanted to interrupt her. I heard on a certain occasion she'd been outspoken, and I wanted to know by whom.
Great stuff by former Governor Happy Chandler. Reliving today some of the old shows from Pondering Kentucky with Kentucky Broadcast Hall of Famer Glen Bastin. Back with more in our next half hour. Stay with us. My name is Charlie Bagwin. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We're back on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Bagwin. Listen, if you would like to hear this show again, or if there's any old shows you'd like to dig out of the archives, it's pretty easy to do. 3 places you can go. The first is myhuntingandfishing.com. Also find us on iTunes, as well as on our YouTube channel. Back with more Pondering Kentucky on Kentucky Afield Radio right after our fishing report.
This is Tom with your fishing report from the Northeast. Cave Run Lake is all the way down to Winter Pool, meaning there are a few ramps on the lake that will be closed due to the low water. Call the Forest Service to check out what ramps to make sure they're open before you head out to the lake. Largemouth bass on Cave Run are slow and deep. Try fishing around 20 to 25 feet with jigs. Crappie are great up the river, around stick-ups and 15 to 20 feet of water. Same story up on Grayson. Largemouth are slow and deep, staged off of main lake points, and crappie are on brush or stick-ups in deeper water as well. Focus on the Clifty, Bruin, and the confluence areas for both of these species. Sauger are also a good bet right now, other than the usual action behind the Greenup Lock and Dam on the Ohio River. You could also head out to Kentucky River and fish behind dams 11 and 14. Behind 14, try fishing the mouth of Sturgeon Creek, but be cautious as you may lay into a muskie in this area as well. Remember, wear your life jacket and stay safe on the water.
Hi, this is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. Warmer weather this week has provided some good opportunities for fishing. Anglers catching crappie well at area lakes and shallow shoreline water. Brush will concentrate fish better, but there are many fish randomly scattered along shoreline areas. Boaters were catching good numbers of crappie at Dewey, Fish Trap, and Yatesville lakes. The past week had improved success for channel catfish in area lakes. Keeper fish coming from shallow water areas on mud flats with cut bait. With the channel catfish, best numbers seem to be coming at Yatesville Lake. Some good reports have also come from area lakes that recently received trout stockings, such as Kingdom Come, Fish Pond, Milo Lake, Martin County, and Paintsville Lake. Bait suspended under floater was catching these fish.
Hi, this is John Williams with the Fishery Report for Southeast Kentucky. At Cedar Creek Lake, our krill clerk reports that the crappie fishing has been excellent as of late. Some really nice crappie being caught on jigs and minnows around flooded brush, 15 to 20 feet deep. Also on Cedar Creek Lake, the bass fishing's been a little bit slow, but there's some very nice fish being caught on Alabama rigs. Seems like the bass are suspended a little bit, and you can get them fairly deep, 15 to 20 feet deep. Also, rainbow trout are being caught at Cedar Creek, primarily on rooster tails or other inline spinners. Also in the district, trout are being stocked in Rock Creek this month. Those can be caught on small crankbaits or spinner baits. And finally, at Lake Cumberland, the striped bass should be moving up into the creeks if they're not already there. At least some of those fish will be shallow and can be caught on live bait or big cranks, swim baits, or doll flies with grubs. As always, good luck and be safe.
Baglin here on Kentucky Afield Radio. The hours and hours that go in to 5 minutes a day. More conversation with Glen Bastin of Pondering Kentucky after the break.
Boys were in trouble. About 10 seconds later, he said boys were going down.
A true story.
And it sunk right out from under us.
20 degrees.
Within seconds, one boating trip went
straight down.
The water was bone-chilling.
Once you hit that water, it's so cold you can't move.
The human body wasn't designed for this.
It took my breath away as soon as I hit it, and my hands were so cold in a matter of seconds that I couldn't pop the clip on my waders to get them off.
Conditions were so bad, it's amazing that anybody survived.
Perfect for duck hunting, but not for a swim in the middle of a river.
Going overboard is never the thought.
You have to think ahead.
Fun can turn frantic in seconds.
There's no time to react when your world just sinks out from under you.
3 hunters, 2 survivors, 1 reason.
Your life jacket's got your back.
Make sure your first mate isn't your last.
I really don't think that I could have made it without a life jacket.
Your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, your life jacket's got your back, and the backing of sportsmen on winter water everywhere. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. I personally have been in the broadcasting business on the air since 1981. And there was a time that one program was, maybe it wasn't written down, but simply forbidden to ever mention another program that was on another station or another channel. Instead, you would hear these vagaries such as, you saw it on another program or another newscast on another station or on another network. Those days have passed, I do believe. I personally am a big fan of Pondering Kentucky, and I don't mind a bit to talk about it. Popular throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, hosted by my guest today, Glen Bastin. And Pondering Kentucky shared an interest in our wildlife, our wild outdoors, conservation, and enjoyed telling the stories.
The problem with researching Daniel Boone is that there are so many popular myths. He's come into the American legend so deeply, it's very, very, very difficult to separate the legend from the truth. But most historians agree that there is no indication he ever wore the famous coonskin cap.
What?
Yeah, I know.
Back to the production of this. If you did 5 minutes a day and it took you 5 or 6 hours, we used to use something called magnetic tape. Mm-hmm. And if you recorded on cassette, if you wanted to edit that, it was done by a series of reel-to-reel tapes, or what we call cart machines, to be able to play just sound bites. Long and short of it is, today you can just put all that into a computer and grab the bytes, and you can put it together in probably 15% of the time.
Well, it would be a lot easier today. There's no doubt about that. In the latter days of Pondering Kentucky, I had moved into digital editing and did have the capability to put it into the computer. It wasn't recorded digitally. It was recorded on analog and then had to be transferred to digital. But yeah, and we used, people might see old movies of people splicing film. Yeah. Well, that's what we did with tape. We used a razor blade and cut the tape and splice it back together with a piece of tape. And
when you got done, you said, look what cool thing I just did. You didn't realize the slavery, the toil, the anguish you had just gone through. But that was the way it was done.
That was the way it was done.
Now, if you were on 85 radio stations across the state, at some point you had to make a living doing this.
Yeah, it had its sponsorship that was on a network-wide basis. We had commercials that were put in the program.
Who were your sponsors?
Oh, we had the rural electric cooperatives, tourism. We had a phone company. There various throughout the years as to what was on it. But no, the stations did not pay for it. although the stations had the opportunity to sell their own commercials around it. The broadcast served several purposes, I think. One, stations in those days had requirements by the FCC that they present certain forms of programming, and Pondering Kentucky could be classed as public affairs programming, which they were required to carry in some form or fashion. But it also was a program that caught on with an audience, and it just sort of mushroomed. There was a point when we reached a number of stations. I don't remember the exact number, but we had a discussion. It's costing us more to add stations than we're getting back out of it. And so we stopped soliciting. And stations, if they came to us and said, we'd like to have the broadcast, okay, that was fine, but we stopped actively soliciting stations because we reached the point of diminishing returns on whether or not it would add additional monies to what we were doing.
What was it? Did you make 85 different cassette tapes a week?
That's exactly what we did. We bought a piece of machinery that would do that at high speed. I think we made 27 tapes at a time, and you could do a half-hour tape in about a minute and a half on this high-speed machinery.
Would each tape have, a week's worth of shows?
Yes, and you zip those through, and you put them in envelopes, which had an expense, and the tape had an expense, and you put postage on it, which had an expense, and and so we probably could have had more stations if we had worked at it after that point, but we reached a maximum that we could charge for commercials, and so it was.
When did it end?
It ended in 93. Tragic situation. I lost a son, and my wife and I sort of took a year off and didn't do anything. And at that same time, a lot of things were changing in the commercial world. Instead of wanting to reach a statewide audience, an advertiser only wanted to reach a small section of it, zones, if you will. Mm-hmm. That all occurred, and it just I didn't have the desire to go back into it, and particularly when I realized the problems I was going to have making that buck out of it again.
It's a lot of work. For a 5-minute show that you hear once a day, 5 to 6 days a week, you would think that would be the easiest thing. Good God, couldn't I have a job like that? How many hours a week did you spend on that?
Oh, geez, I don't know that I ever counted it
50, totally. 60, 70?
Oh, at least 60, probably closer to 70. There were many nights that it was midnight, 2 a.m. before things would shut down. Interesting thing about that broadcast, it was played more than one time a day by some stations. And I know of a few stations that had old tapes and continued to play them after the program was discontinued.
Neat. Well, it's sort of like Paul Harvey. It reminds me of the Paul Harvey show. The rest of the story.
The greatest writer broadcasting has ever experienced, I think.
He knew how it was done. He would get your attention, and you would listen.
Yeah, he and Charles Osgood. Yes. Charles Osgood, he's still on the radio, but not many stations are carrying him. But he also had that knack for grabbing your attention. He does a television broadcast on Sunday morning now that I watch religiously.
CBS Sunday morning.
Yes.
While we're on the old folks, Charles Kuralt, I liked a lot.
Charles Kuralt was a great broadcaster. He and my buddy Byron Crawford struck up a great friendship because they did similar things in television. Charles Kuralt did it on a national basis, and Byron did it here in Kentucky.
Again, we're Kentucky Afield Radio, so we'll be talking a lot about Kentucky and some of the characters that make up our state, but wildlife, of course, a big focus of the show. Wildlife has a special place in your heart. I remember you would come to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, do stories on bats and snakes with a fellow I still have on this show named John McGregor.
John is a biologist that is just phenomenal when it comes to knowledge of Kentucky wildlife. Not the wildlife maybe that everybody thinks of, deer, turkey. No, John is more into glass snakes and the frogs And it just still blows me away when he says there are no bullfrogs in Pike County. I don't know if he's still saying that or not, but he did 20 years ago. But he's into the maybe unseen wildlife. And we were talking about snakes one time, and I said something about a snake bite. He said, "Oh, yeah, I'd much rather have a snake bite me than a human bite me." I said, "John, what?" He said, "Oh, yeah, humans' mouths are full of all kinds of germs."
Do you recall some of your favorite wildlife stories from Pondering Kentucky?
Well, that certainly was one of them. We may have been doing the glass snake. And for those of you unfamiliar with it, the glass snake is actually a lizard, I think, but it's called a glass snake. And if it's under attack, it can separate its tail. And the tail will either wiggling while it gets away and whatever goes after the tail, but it can regrow that tail. I think that's phenomenal in wildlife. The frog story was a grand one. I used to do a lot with John Wilson. John was one of my favorite people. He, too, was filled with information about various forms of wildlife that is sort of out of the norm or out of the everyday thinking of people. He's the one who showed me the albino coyote. The story of the bears coming back into Kentucky. That was one that was intriguing. I used to be asked frequently what my favorite Pondering Kentucky story was, and my answer was always the one coming up. Yeah. So I guess I would say that about a favorite of fish and wildlife. There's going to be something come up here shortly that's going to be interesting. I was reading a story over the weekend about the outlook for the deer harvest this year. I think last year was a record year for deer harvest.
Yes, we've had a couple of record deer harvests. This past September was the record for deer harvest in September. And so, people...
that was just the archery season?
Right, that's the archery season. Yeah, there's always something new in the great outdoors.
Another favorite story was John Wilson, who was I guess, the public information officer. Yeah. I don't know exactly what his title was. He also had a little string band, and they did a song about stalking trout that was just hilarious, and it led to me doing a story on trout stalking, and how people would wait for the truck to come so they could go trout fishing, and there's just a lot of great memories there.
Pondering Kentucky, the magazine, is also able to bring you real examples of the many unsurpassed talents of Kentuckians. That really is not a tractor-trailer truck going through the gears in the background. It's Homer Luster from Middleburg in Casey County doing one of his combustible engine imitations.
Memories from the 1980s from a show that was timeless. When we come back, we'll go beyond pondering. You're listening to Pondering Kentucky on Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. Back in our final few with Glen Bastin, host of the radio show from the 1980s and early 90s, Pondering Kentucky. A favorite across our Commonwealth on radio stations everywhere. It taught us about what makes Kentucky different from anywhere else. The people, places, inventions, first cheeseburger, wildlife, our music. A show that celebrated the secrets of our state that may have never otherwise ever been told. Glen Bastin, the host, is my guest, and would you do it again?
Well, if I wasn't 69 years old, I might think about it.
Looking back on
Charlie, it was an absolute joy. The experiences I had, the people I met, the things I got to see and do, it just priceless. Yes, I would do it again.
This went from 82 to around 1993.
94, 93, I think.
So you had a good solid 11 years in there of doing what you wanted to do most in this world.
Yeah, and did hours and hours and hours of conversations with people who had made history. The true value of this is folk history. I mean, it was Kentucky by Kentuckians. And I'm delighted to say that all of those interviews have been preserved. They are now in the hands of the University of Kentucky Oral History Program. Upon my death, they will be released. The transcripts are available now, but they will be released for whatever historical purpose there might be. And there's some history in there. There was a piece with Happy Chandler that he didn't put in his book, and I'm surprised. But well, I can understand why, I guess, in a way. We're talking about politics, and I said, Governor, do you think that we'll ever be able to get rid of corruption in politics? And he said, no, son, I don't think so. He said, I remember Tom Ray. Tom Ray was his primary opponent in his first run for governor in 1935. He said, I remember Tom Ray beat me by 28,000 votes in Logan County. Now, there weren't that many men, women, children, black or white, in Logan County. But that's okay. I beat him by 28,000 in Letcher. And as you did, I chuckled. And Happy added, and we voted him the night before. In his 90th year, he decided to pop that out there.
Did you do many of your shows by telephone, or were you always in the field doing this eye to eye?
No, I did some by phone. I happened to be in the studio one day, and I had heard that Pat Sajak, the Wheel of Fortune guy, had started his broadcast career in Kentucky.
Was it at Murray?
It was at Murray. He had been in the Army. Another soldier he had worked with was from Murray, and I called him and said, why don't you come down here and work with us in Murray? So Pat did, and that's where he got his start. Went on from there into Nashville, became a weatherman, went to the West Coast, and became a star on Wheel of Fortune. Somebody told me that story, and I thought, well, maybe I'll try to get a hold of Pat Sajak. So I called the Wheel of Fortune offices. They said, yeah, we think we can get to contact you. I was sitting in the studio one morning, and the phone rang. And for some reason, I don't know why, I thought, I'm going to roll a tape before I answer this. I picked up the phone, hello, and the operator says, we have a collect call from Pat Sajak. Will you accept?
And did you accept the charges?
I did, and he was calling from Las Vegas.
Yeah. Worth every dollar that phone. How long did you all talk?
Geez, I don't remember, Charlie. Probably for 15 or 20 minutes.
We were, you and I, at the Kentucky Broadcasters Association conference in October. This was in Lexington. And we were shooting the breeze with a lot of fellow broadcasters from around the state. And there was a fellow there from KNN. It was Mark Williams.
The News Network.
But you had said, my name is Glen Bastin. I used to be somebody. I remember those words. Fame is fleeting. How big of somebody were you? Could you walk into a grocery store and speak out loud and people know who you were?
Would you believe that still happens?
Does it really?
Yes.
You are somebody, and if anybody says, yeah, maybe I've heard this voice, if they'll remember back right after the turn of the century, early 2000s, they would hear you on commercials. I'm Glen Bastin, Honorable Order of Kentucky Colonels.
Yeah, I'm Kentucky Colonel Glen Bastin. Yes.
Was that how you would introduce yourself?
Yes. I did. I worked with the Kentucky Colonels for 14 years as their chief executive, which was another wonderful experience. The Kentucky Colonels organization pumps about $1.5 million a year into the charities of Kentucky, from one end of the state to the other. And that was a very satisfying, gratifying position to hold. What was accomplished, or what is being accomplished by the Kentucky Colonels, they weren't made up. I mean, they were actually true stories. And I tried to tell them somewhat in the fashion of the way I produced the Pondering Kentucky broadcast.
I made a list here of some of the more popular Kentucky Colonels. George Clooney, Johnny Depp, Muhammad Ali, Colonel Sanders, Whoopi Goldberg, Bill Clinton, Elvis was a Kentucky Colonel. I've noticed that you don't call it the Kentucky Colonels. You call it the Honorable Order. And that comes out of your mouth automatically.
The name actually came from Governor LaFoon in 1932. The organization, as an organization, started in 1931. And in 32, it was called the Kentucky Colonels. And in 32, LaFoon, who was pretty good at self-promotion, directed it to be called the Honorable Order of Kentucky Colonels.
You brought home a few journalism awards in your time behind a microphone.
A few.
In 2004, you were inducted into the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one of the more prestigious of your day?
Well, here in Kentucky, that's a very prestigious one. I'm also delighted and honored to be in the Kentucky Broadcasters Hall.
What would you say to a student? Somebody saying, I heard a show on NPR, I can do it better.
Well, I don't think have any marvelous or grandiose advice. I think those of us who've done these sorts of things, you, myself, Byron Crawford, but it's not something that just happens overnight. It takes a lot of work in order to accomplish the things that I've been able to accomplish.
Are those stories out there still needing to be told?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's not a day goes by I don't come up with something and think, that was a Pondering Kentucky story.
One question I always ask my guests, and most of the time the answer is no. Do you text and drive?
No.
Thanks for coming by.
I appreciate it, and I'll always be Glen Bastin, Pondering Kentucky.
My friend, my hero. We're out of time. This is Charlie Bagwell inviting you to join us in a week, and we will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.